Hello friends and welcome to the EPG Pathshala. My name is Nilufer Barucha and I am adjunct faculty in the Department of English and the director and scientist in charge of the Constructions of Home and Belonging Indian Diaspora Center, what we briefly called COHAB IDC at the University of Mumbai. Today I am going to talk to you about Indian diasporic literature written in English. The Indian diaspora is the second largest diaspora in the world after the Chinese. There are at least 26 million Indians living in diaspora today. And what marks them as a diasporic community is what I think of as home consciousness, the awareness that they have a home in the land they have left behind and they have a home in the new land that they have adopted. They may be first generation diasporics, they may be second or third generation diasporics, but most of them still retain their home consciousness. This home consciousness is what leads to either a hybrid or a hyphenated identity amongst diasporic Indians. It leads them to search for their roots, and this is what they write about. This is what diasporic literature written by Indians is all about. And I've also said that I'm going to talk about diasporic literature written in English. This is because Indians have written literature from the diaspora in other languages. We have Tamil literature written from the diaspora, we have Bengali, Marathi literature, but this particular module on which this talk is based is on diasporic Indians writing literature in English. Before I begin talking about Indian diasporic literature in English, I would like to quickly review the history of the Indian diaspora. This history can be divided into three main categories: pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. The word colonial here refers to the European colonization of India. In the context of pre-colonial diasporas, one needs to note that Indians have a long history as traders and travelers to countries bordering the Indian Ocean and beyond. This was what we call the Maritime Diaspora. Indian traders also had a strong presence along the land-based routes that spanned China, Central Asia, northwestern India via Central Europe. Ancient Indians had traded with the Persians and with the Arab world, the kingdoms of East Africa, as well as with Lanka, Burma, Southeast Asia, and the Malay Peninsula. Unfortunately, there is no creative writing or literature available recording these travels or these maritime diasporas or the land-based diasporas, which are also called the caravan diasporas. Available Indian diasporic literature starts with those who migrated voluntarily or involuntarily during the British colonization of India. The Indian diaspora of the colonial period began with the end of legal slavery in the early 1830s. This resulted in recruitment of indentured labor from India to fill the gaps in the labor markets of the other British colonies. So from the 1830s till the 1920s, over 1 million Indians were displaced all over the globe, from the islands of the African coast such as Mauritius and Seychelles, to South and East Africa, to the Caribbean islands, to Burma, Malaya, Singapore, and Fiji. A huge number of Indians were taken as indentured labor to these far-off spaces from which very few of them ever returned. Once they had crossed the Kala Pani, the way back was not available due to caste taboos. So at the end of their indentured period, they stayed back in the new land and made that their home. The indentured labor settlements led to the need for Indian traders and professionals to meet the daily requirements of those who had stayed on in their new homelands after their contract got over, but to retain their consciousness of India as home. So when it came to the employment of lawyers, teachers and doctors, the Indian diasporics preferred to import them from their old homelands. Mahatma Gandhi was one such import. He had first gone in 1893 to Natal in South Africa as a lawyer for an Indian businessman there from Gujarat. Gandhi had returned to India on 9th January 1915 at the persuasion of Congress leaders to lead India's freedom struggle. You would know that this day is since 1993 celebrated as Pravasi Bharati Divas by the Indian government. As for the postcolonial Indian diasporas, they are dated after the end of British colonial rule in India in 1947. Centuries of an exploitative colonial economy had left the newly independent India a nation state poor in material terms. The war casualties had on the other hand left Britain with insufficient labor. So skilled and semi-skilled factory and transport workers from India migrated to the UK. With the introduction of the welfare state by the Labour government, Britain also called from India doctors and nurses, teachers and engineers. This labour and professional diaspora was followed by the post-colonial entrepreneurial diaspora and the academic diaspora in Britain. The post-colonial Indian diaspora then also spread to Canada and the USA. It was, however, the USA which attracted the largest number of Indian students in the 1970s and the 1980s with new, more liberal quotas for student visas and then the green cards on offer to highly qualified professionals. The majority of this green card holding, highly paid and well-educated Indian diaspora decided against the surrender of their Indian passports and became NRIs, non-resident Indians. The NRIs had a very strong home consciousness and sought to impose it on their children, which created generational conflict in this diaspora to an extent greater than anywhere else. The generational conflict in this diaspora is well represented in the literature of writers such as Jhumpa Lahiri. Read her novel The Namesake, which came out in 2003 and which has also been turned into a film in 2006 by the diasporic filmmaker Meera Nair, and about which I'll be giving you more details very soon in this talk. In addition to these colonial and post-colonial diasporas, there are also today Indians who live and work across borders, including in non-Anglophonic European countries and those of the South American continent. These are usually IT professionals or highly qualified technocrats, either directly employed by employers in other countries or are outsourced by their Indian or multinational companies in India to their foreign partners. This group of Indians with a scientific and technical orientation has still not begun to produce any literature that describes their lives across borders, real and virtual. The colonial and post-colonial diasporas have produced ample literature and now also cinema. The focus in this talk, though, is only on literature. These literary manifestations have been an attempt by the diasporics to understand themselves and also to project themselves to the world. As diasporics, they have faced discrimination and loss of self in their new homelands and seek to retrieve both by the act of writing. Even though some have lived in their new homelands for over 100 years, such as those in the West Indies, the awareness of home is still very strong and is present in their writings as nostalgia and pain. The indentured labour diaspora in the West Indian islands were generally illiterate peasants, and their link with the old homeland was usually sustained by a copy of the Indian epic Ramayana. Many of them had taken with them as a talisman. Some critics of the Indian diasporic literature see the descendants of these indentured labourers as so many Rams in exile, who were banished from their homelands and sent into exile in a strange land for reasons ranging from poverty to caste atrocities, and in the case of women, from widowhood to abandonment. The expression of longing and nostalgia for the old homeland is a common motive in much of the literature of the colonial diaspora, which had experienced the greatest loss of self and diminution of status. They had endured long and perilous sea voyages, and in their new destinations suffered a loss of not just social moorings, but experienced ignominy and humiliation. For instance, the degrading tag of coolie was attached to the Indian diasporics in the West Indies, South and East Africa, as well as in Mauritius and in Fiji. The feeling of longing for the old homeland is most clearly expressed in the poetry of the Indo-Fijian poet Sudesh Mishra. Mishra has in his poems used Hindi poetry's Bidesiya tradition, Bidesiya being one who is a foreigner. He writes about the beloved who has been left behind by the lover and who pines for him as he has become a Bidesiya, a foreigner. In Mishra's poetry, though, the strategy of inversion makes the old Indian homeland Des, and the man who has left the Des becomes the Bidesiya, the foreigner. So the poet longs for his old homeland, longs for his Bidesiya. The feeling of longing for the old homeland is most clearly expressed in the poetry of the Indo-Fijian Sudesh Mishra. Mishra has in his poems used Hindi poetry's Bidesiya tradition. The beloved who has been left behind by the lover pines for him, who has through his travels become a Bidesiya, a foreigner. In Mishra's poetry, through the strategy of inversion, it's the old homeland India which has from Des, one's own country, become Bides, the foreign land, for which the poet, in the guise of the beloved, longs for and calls his Bidesiya home. You could read Mishra's poem, The Time is Out of Joint, which he published in 2002, to better understand the Bidesiya mode of poetry. However, not all these old diasporics cherish nostalgia for India. The Nobel laureate V.S. Naipaul, an Indo-Trinidadian, has had a troubled relationship with his original homeland and now lives in a double diaspora in Britain. There are also some diasporic Indians from the West Indies who have intermarried with the black West Indians who either retain their Indianness or, like Sam Selwyn, the writer who moved to Britain, are in denial of their Indian identity. Thus, another issue Indian diasporic literature deals with is the issue of identity. The questions of who am I? Where do I belong? Am I a West Indian or am I still an Indian? Am I British or am I Indian? Am I American or am I Indian? Are questions that haunt the diasporics. Identity is a complex issue, so it is not always sufficient for a diasporic, especially the colonial diasporic, to jettison his or her old identity and adopt a new one. It is also essential for the host country to recognize this new identity. For instance, the Indian diasporics in East Africa had to leave their new homelands when these newly independent countries began an Africanization program. This also happened in the West Indies, although it was not an official policy as it had been in Uganda. This kind of rejection by the new homeland leads to a double diasporization, and the literature of the double diasporics, such as that of the Afro-Indo-Canadian writer M.G. Vasanji, which is a good example of this kind of double diasporic literature. Not all double diasporics, though, are forced to leave their new homelands. Some of them choose to do so for economic or academic reasons. Linked to the matter of identity is the question whether the diasporic Indian has a hyphenated identity or a hybrid identity. The term hybrid initially denoted a grafted plant which displays characteristics of both old and new sources, but is in many ways different from both of them. Postcolonial meta-theorist Homi K. Bhabha sees hybridity as a third space in the context of diasporics. The sociologist and postcolonial critic Avtar Bra calls this phenomenon the occupation by diasporics of a space, not the same but not different, intersectionality. What then is a hyphenated identity, such as the one adopted by the Indo-Canadians in Canada? Is the hyphen an indication of less assimilation and integration into the host population than those who are supposed to be hybrids? Or is it a proud assertion of the older identity on par with the newer one? It would be interesting for you to read the literature produced by Indo-Canadian writers such as Uma Parmeswaran, Anita Rao Badami, Rohinton Mistry, Shauna Singh Baldwin, and many others to see how far these writers and their characters are integrated and assimilated into the Canadian space. You could, for a start, begin with Parmeswaran's novels such as Mangoes on the Maple Tree, which came out in 2006. You could also try and read a short story from Mistry's collection Tales from Ferozshabad, the short story being Swimming Lessons. We have so far been talking about the content of diasporic Indian literature and their characteristic features of nostalgia, longing, pain, and problems with identity. However, one also needs to look at the form of this writing. How do the diaspora writers construct their literature? What are the narrative styles used by these writers? These are very important questions, as it's not just what you write, but how you write that feeds into the impact made by any writer on his or her readers. Like the postcolonial Indian writers, the diasporic Indian writers also use their colonizers' language to not merely curse with, like Shakespeare's Caliban in the play The Tempest. Caliban had been taught his master Prospero's language, but felt he had no profit from it, but to use it to curse his master. The postcolonial and diasporic writers, however, use, or rather appropriate, their master's language to subvert the privileging of colonial discourse and the hegemony of Western narrative modes. It is thus that they sabotage the unequal Prospero-Caliban dichotomy. How do postcolonial narrative modes manage the sabotage of unequal linguistic power relations? They do this by using alternative non-Western narrative modes, what is called orature, or the adoption of oral literary modes in the written text. The Western world and its colonizers went armed not just with guns and swords to other parts of the globe, but also with the word, with the logos, the written text. Many of the countries they colonized were pre-literate societies, but had their own rich cultures. This oral culture was negated by the colonizer, and these societies termed savage and barbaric. So in order to now, in the post-colonial times, reverse and subvert such cultural prejudices, post-colonial writers use the storytelling modes of oral cultures. These modes of narration are usually non-linear. Stories in such narratives are often told by alternate voices, and instead of a singular ending or opinion, they offer multiple ones. Postcolonial writers also use non-Western literary styles, such as that of the Indian epics, or tales which employ non-realistic storytelling modes. This is also the style used by Islamic literary culture, for instance in the Arabian Nights or in the Shahnama. A related stylistic mode is that of linked stories. Non-Western literatures did not have the novel form until it was introduced to them by the colonizers in the 19th century. However, they did have linked narratives like those in the Arabian Nights, which is after its narrator Sherazad, called the Sherazadic style. These narratives were also often non-realistic and used magic in their stories. Many diasporic writers have used the Sherazadic mode of narration and also subverted Western realistic narrative modes by the use of magic realism. In addition to the towering figure of Salman Rushdie, the postcolonial economic and academic diasporas have their own representative writers in North America, such as Rohinton Mistry, Jhumpa Lahiri, Kiran Desai, Vikram Chandra, and Bharati Mukherjee. In Britain, there is a towering figure of Salman Rushdie, of course, but there are also first and second generation writers such as Sunetra Gupta, Atima Srivastava, and Farokh Tondi. The petroleum diaspora, which is the Indian diaspora in the Arab states, has given us the bilingual writer Vilas Sarang. This is just a representative and not a complete list of Indian diasporic writers. It is not possible in this talk to deal with all the writers I have just mentioned or even all the books of all these writers. So I would like to focus on 3 writers, Salman Rushdie, Rohinton Mistry and Jhumpa Lahiri, and also on some of their texts. Salman Rushdie's texts began to appear at a time when the first postcolonial generation had come of age in the erstwhile colonies of the British Empire. In Britain too, this was a time when the first post-war, post-imperial generation, never to have experienced the empire firsthand, had come of maturity. In the 1980s in the UK, there was a tremendous nostalgia for the Raj phenomenon, fueled as much by Mrs. Margaret Thatcher's put the great back into Britain rhetoric as it was by the post-imperial generation's desire to connect with their past. Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, which came out in 1981, became highly visible after receiving the Booker Prize and provided a vehicle for such time travel. In India too, the first generation not to have personally experienced colonialism became time travelers into the past of Salim and Shiva, the 2 heroes of Midnight's Children. Fed so far on official histories of India's independence struggles against the Raj, this generation revelled in the alternative narratives and magic realism of Rushdie's texts. In Midnight's Children, Rushdie has used the Scheherazadic narrative mode, an alternative narratorial device to subvert Western hegemony. This book has gone on to become an iconic text and has won Rushdie several awards. It has also been turned into a film. You should read this text as an introduction to postcolonial diasporic writing. The work of the Canada-based Parsi Zoroastrian writer Rohinton Mistry is a good example of ethnocentric diasporic literature, focused as it is on the Parsis, but it also works at the level of multiculturalism and transnationalism. Rohinton Mistry's first collection of short stories, Tales from Ferozshabad, which came out in 1987, is set almost exclusively in Bombay, which is what the city was known at that time. Today, of course, we are Mumbai. But there are 3 stories in this collection which are either partially or wholly set in Canada. These 3 stories are The Squatter, Lend Me Your Light, and Swimming Lessons, which I've already referred to. In such a long journey, his first novel, Mistry uses Scheherazadic narrative technique to tell the story of a group of Parsis against the backdrop of the 1971 war that India had fought with Pakistan and which led to the creation of Bangladesh. In this text, the Parsi world gradually moves out of its self-imposed isolation and interacts at the highest political and financial levels with the wider Indian world. In this text, Mistry's discourse transcends the boundaries of the Parsi self and moves into the wider areas of the nation space. However, this doesn't mean that the Parsi identity is not evident, but that the focus has changed. A Fine Balance, which came out in 1995, which is Mistry's second novel, records the dark episode in postcolonial Indian history when the then Prime Minister Mrs. Indira Gandhi had suspended the constitution and declared an internal emergency. With Family Matters, Mistry moves back into the ethno-religious space of the Bombay Parsis. The miniature Parsi world, though, is enriched by the literary prowess and emotional maturity of a writer at the height of his writing talent. I'm speaking about Family Matters. Foregrounded in this novel are not just the problems of the aging Nariman Vakil, but those of an aging community at large. So one could look at Vakil in this novel as a metaphor for a geriatric community, i.e. the Parsi Zoroastrian community, which is today on the brink of extinction. Jhumpa Lahiri's collection of short stories, The Interpreter of Maladies, which came out in 1999, the second collection of short stories, Unaccustomed Earth, in 2008, and her 2 novels, The Namesake in 2003 and The Lowland in 2013, have all been very well received and have won several awards. Much of Lahiri's work revolves around the question of identity in a diasporic context. One sees this clearly in the namesake, where Gogol, born in the USA to an academician father and homemaker mother, tries very hard to become American, even abandons his name Gogol, prefers the company of the parents of his white upper-class American girlfriend to that of his own parents. However, ultimately, when his father dies suddenly, he puts on his long neglected Indian self, like the overcoat in his namesake Gogol's story. He shaves his head, dons white mourning clothes, much to the chagrin of the girlfriend who fails to recognize her partner in this alternative identity. In the novel Lowland, Lahiri has shifted to a partially Indian setting, and this is a novel which is set in Calcutta. And this is Calcutta of the Nakshal period, the tumultuous Calcutta of the 1960s and 70s. The text here narrates the story of two brothers, Udayan, who was a Nakshal activist, and his brother Subhash, who chooses a more sedate life as a researcher in the USA. Caught between the two brothers is the woman who Udayan marries, the woman who is pregnant at the time when Udayan is killed by the police, the woman who then is taken by the other brother, by Subhash, to the USA, but who refuses to really become a wife to Subhash. This is a rather problematic story as far as the character of the female protagonist is concerned. You should try and read it and come to your own conclusions. Friends, I shall now leave you to read in detail this module on Indian diasporic literature in English. I've taken you on a whirlwind tour of not just the books written by Indian diasporics in English, but also of the Indian diaspora itself. Try and also look at the points to ponder section in this module and try to relate the diasporic writing to the Indian situation. What makes these diasporic texts relevant to you in India today, or if you are outside India, to you in a situation in your own setting. Also look at the section, the video sections in this module, where I have put in interviews with these writers. If you go through these interviews with these writers, you will find them coming alive. They will have a face, they will have a voice. You will not only find impression of the critics on their work, but their own impressions about their own work. So after all, the writer will also have his or her own say. Enjoy the module, have fun, read well. Thank you.